I'd like to tell you a story. One of my biggest fears is getting stuck alone in a heavy blizzard. This fear was ignited in me one day when I was quite young, around 8 or 9 years old, I think, when I went snowboarding on a particularly cold evening. It was around -30°C, which wasn't unusual for the winter at that time. I had snowboarded in that temperature before. This wasn't anything new. It was the early 2000s, and at that time, winters not only lasted longer, but were much colder than they are today. God, I sound old. When we left the house, it was, as stated before, -30°C, give or take a couple of degrees. It was about a 40-minute drive to the hills, and about another 15 minutes to get suited up and ready. I was snowboarding with my older brother, who was a person that, to this day, I have rarely ever gotten along with. Why is that important? We'll get to that later. We started out by going down a couple of easier hills to warm up, as we weren't avid snowboarders, and we had just escaped our beginner phase. That took about another 20 to 30 minutes. We decided that we were going to try and tackle a hill that was rated a black diamond, aka hard difficulty. Our mother, who had dropped us off, was not a skier or a snowboarder and was waiting for us inside the chalet that was in the center of the resort, enjoying some tea and some food. My brother and I had noticed that it had started getting colder, so we would probably only get one more run in before our mother would come out and wait for us to tell us that we were done. So we wanted to make it a good one. You know, because we were idiots. We were young and invincible. So we hop on the ski lift, and we make our way up. This ski lift ride was much longer than the 2 hills prior. Sitting on this chair, above the trees, we begin to feel the wind, unhindered by the surrounding foliage. It is bitter now. Spine-chilling cold. The kind of cold that gets you no matter how many layers you put on. It's clear that the temperature is dropping, and pretty quickly at that. As soon as we reached the top of the lift, the wind had started picking up as well. Tougher and colder breezes tossed the top layer of powdery snow all around. Regret had begun to set in, but we remained confident that we would reach the bottom of the hill, and that all would be well. We didn't have a cell phone, so the only way to get to our mother was through the storm. So we tightened our goggles, made sure our board buckles were fastened tightly, and began our descent. As soon as I started my way down, I realized a few things. One, that we were snowboarding directly into the wind. Powder was hitting my face. It felt as if the world itself was trying to push me over with how strong the wind was. 2, the fresh snow on the hill had become frozen, as the powdered snow that was hitting my face felt like little icicles stabbing my chin as they were being kicked up by the wind. And 3, the wall of snow coming from above and below was clouding my vision so badly that I had lost sight of my brother as soon as I picked up speed, which on a frozen hill happened immediately. I couldn't turn. I couldn't weave. All of my efforts weren't strong enough to combat the wind and the ice on this hill. And after about 20 to 30 seconds of frightened acceleration, I hit a bump, and I fell. I fell sideways and began rolling and bouncing my way down the hill, slamming repeatedly into the ground until I crashed into a pile of pads and sandbags that the resort had placed around the ski lift poles to prevent people from slamming into them directly. The wind had been knocked out of me, and all I could see was snow. One of my foot buckles had come undone during the fall. It was a miracle that I didn't break any bones or sprain anything. My goggles were soaked from slamming into the wet ground repeatedly. My vision was blurry, and I was alone. Pretty soon after the crash, the water on my goggles froze, distorting my vision further. I took off my goggles to try and see, but then the full force of the blizzard now met my eyes. Little shards of ice beat against my full face, some landing in my eye directly and melting on impact. It hurt. A lot. I put my frozen goggles back on, and I started to cry. I was terrified. I was blind, and I was by myself. I was an anxious kid. I still deal with anxiety to this day, and on top of that, I had a vivid imagination. I had thoughts that I was going to die. I knew I had to move, and I wanted to, but my panic paralyzed me. I got stuck in a never-ending spiral of anguished worries and what-if scenarios that always ended up with me not making it off of this hill. But suddenly, I hear a bunch of snow get kicked up. The haunting rhythm of my panicked waking nightmare was suddenly shattered. It was my brother. He somehow managed to find me on the ground through the blizzard and came over. He was a much stronger snowboarder than I, and on top of that, just physically stronger than me. So he had managed to navigate the blizzard with some tact, but it was clear that he had fallen at least once before reaching me, due to the snow frozen to the back of his jacket and his pants. His goggles had frozen over as well. He sat with me as I regained my composure and got my bearings. By the time I had gotten control of my emotions, my buckles had frozen and wouldn't fit back into the locking mechanism. We scraped the ice off with the mechanism itself, which took a few minutes. He reassured me that we would make it to the bottom of the hill. This is one of the few times in my life that I saw a version of my brother that I could truly look up to and and respect. The dire situation had brought out the best aspects of him. Because of this shift in his personality, I could tell that he was also afraid, but he was tougher than me. I was a kid. I am and always have been a sensitive guy, and learning to manage my emotions was a long battle for me. And at this point in my life, I hadn't even started that fight. We scraped the ice off of our goggles with our boots. We took a couple of deep breaths, put our goggles back on, said a collective, "Let's do this," got up and started our way down the hill again. I couldn't control my speed on the hill, so I kept falling my way down the hill to ensure that I didn't slam into something at high speed. Fall after fall, I tried to land in a way that would injure me the least, but the cold had made moving itself painful. Eventually, after many falls that would amount to a few gnarly bruises, we made it, and we were safe. Our mother got us hot chocolate and made sure we were okay, and my brother went right back to bullying me as usual. So why am I telling you this? The horror and hopelessness of being trapped in the cold are callous reminders of how, despite its beauty, the world can be a truly cruel and uncaring place. Such dire circumstances have the potential to reveal the strength and greatness within humanity, but also its worst traits. No game I have ever played has shown how humanity handles being at the end of its rope quite like Frostpunk. Developed and published by 11-Bit Studios, it is one of my favorite games of all time. Let's talk about it. Much like the rest of 11-Bit Studios' catalog, Frostpunk is a tale of finding hope in a cruel and uncaring world. The premise of the main story scenario, called A New Home, is simple, but remarkably effective. It's a steampunk Victorian England, and after a series of strange weather patterns, the Great Frost has arrived, and the Earth has frozen over. You are the captain of an expedition sent to the site of one of the last remaining working coal generators in the world. Your task? Build the last city on Earth, and make sure it survives, as it is humanity's last hope. Sounds easy, right?
No.
This story is made interesting by having to manage the hope and discontent of your populace, having to sign new laws to manage your populace that you cannot go back on, having to give your people purpose, and having to do these things while the world falls apart around you. And on top of that, there is a superstorm on the way that could freeze hell itself. So much can go wrong in this game. The culmination of many small mistakes leads to impactful, long-lasting consequences. Especially when a movement sparks up in your city called the Londoners, who are people who want to leave and head back to London. You know that these people won't last long if they leave, but they refuse to stay unless you convince them to. The hatred that your populace can have for you can be downright raw. Look at these quotes from when I failed the Fall of Winterhome scenario, which we will briefly talk about later. Another big story moment is when your sister city, Winterhome, is revealed to have fallen. Either you find the city in shambles with scouting parties, or if you don't discover it, the last survivor of Winterhome stumbles their way into your city and dies. The populace immediately loses hope and purpose, and you have to find a way to reignite it. You get two choices, being faith and order. These choices change the flavor of your city and give you more interactions with your populace. And, with both of these paths, you have the potential to turn into a dystopian, authoritarian dictatorship. Dad. Making the irreversible decision to become a dictatorship is a Pyrrhic win condition. This is a genius choice. Being a dictator is easy. What you say goes, and the people have to listen. So of course you survive the apocalypse. But you sacrificed the very thing that made life worth living in the first place. Your humanity. The true story of this game comes from the attempt to maintain your humanity and the humanity of your city, despite the environment and the rash decisions being made by your populace begging you to take away their ability to make decisions from them. This is why I love this game. It is a love letter to the potential good and indomitable nature of the human spirit, the struggles of leadership, and the fight against the temptation of power to maintain humanity. It is all of those things, while also being an acknowledgement of the negative versions of all of those themes within humanity. How stubbornness, while necessary for survival, can lead to ruining your chances. How a people failing their nation is always caused by a nation failing them first. The tagline of this game is, "The city must survive." That holds true, and is communicated in more ways than one. Frostpunk, or Stress Simulator, as I lovingly call it, has gameplay that mainly consists of allocating and gathering resources, planning out your city's expansion to be the most efficient you can be with those resources, while trying to raise hope and lower discontent among your populace. Everything in the gameplay comes back to hope and discontent. Overworking causes discontent. Deaths cause discontent. Hunger causes discontent. Not keeping your promises causes discontent. Being a leader that keeps their promises, signs reasonable laws that pleases their people, allocates time and resources to the people's happiness, and keeps them fed and healthy, will prosper no matter what the storm throws at them. As long as you don't forget about your coal supply. You can't forget about your coal supply. As I mentioned before, there comes a point when the news of Winterhome's demise makes it to your city, and you have to choose order or faith as a way to inspire your people. These choices offer different buildings and laws to help your city combat hopelessness and discontent. This concept is great. However, the only problem that I have with this game is that the gameplay for both of these paths are pretty much identical. There are some differences, but they are very minor, and on top of that, there aren't enough differences. It doesn't mean the gameplay is bad. It's great. But unfortunately, the big decision you have to make doesn't feel as big as it should. If there were more faith in order-specific events that were scripted or otherwise, and maybe 1 or 2 laws for each path, I think the base game scenario would be perfect. There's one final part of the gameplay that needs to be explored: scouting the Frostland. Once you construct your city's beacon, you gain access to scouts, who, as Bricky put it,
Scouts, or by their scientific name, no complainus, big dickus.
And he could not be more correct. These guys do not die to the elements unless they get caught in the superstorm, which is your fault. The only way they die otherwise is due to scripted events where you choose to gamble with their lives for the prospect of additional resources or survivors, like choosing to confront a bear and drive it off to help some people that it was about to eat, getting more citizens for your city. At every second that you are playing Frostpunk, you are bouncing between tasks and thinking about the next move. Coal, wood, steel, food, coal, wood, send the scouts, address people's complaints, food, coal, pass a law, coal, wood, build a structure you promised to, coal, food.
I get it!
To break it down to its core parts, it is a workplace management simulator with a city builder on top of it. It is an exhausting game. It should be an exhausting game, and I love it. By the way, quick thing. I didn't want to make a whole new section for this, but it needs to be stated. Look at the art in this game. It is incredible. It's so bleak, and it truly gives you a window into the horrors of this story. Look at the buildings. They're so f***ing cool. Look at the menus. They're perfect. I love how the transition between menus looks like ice freezing over your screen. Everything in this game is working to immerse you into the story, and it's so good. Also, the music. Just in case the base game scenario isn't enough to convince you to try this out, there are a plethora of other scenarios that are worth quickly talking about. Firstly, we have the Arcs. Doesn't change too much from A New Home, except you get a research site populated by a small group of engineers tasked with nurturing the growth of some very large seedlings. Basically, you gotta keep the seeds heated and automate your city as much as you can because you do not have enough workers. It's a good time if you just want a little more of the base game and to try and use automatons more than people, but I wouldn't play through it more than once. Next up is the Refugees. Another scenario that doesn't change too much from the base game, but this time you're faced with a refugee crisis and you have to deal with overpopulation during the apocalypse. It's a good time as well, but again, I wouldn't do it more than once. Now, this is where you get to the really interesting scenarios. The Fall of Winterhome. That's right, the city that died in the main story, you have to try and save it. Rather than starting at the beginning of a city's planning, you get handed a fully completed and curated shit sandwich that you have to tear down, rebuild, and replan. Oh, also, half of the city has been burnt down because when the previous leader was deposed, there was a brief civil conflict. So, tearing down those buildings and repurposing them cannot be done as quickly as it normally should be and would be. You need to assign workers to do it. Also, you are almost out of all of your resources. Also, your people are not enthusiastic about you being in power. Also, they have almost completely lost hope and are very discontent. This scenario is very hard, especially the beginning. And often, you end up getting banished from the city after a few days because you haven't made any meaningful change or improvement to the situation. The fall of Winterhome is just that. The fall. You winning is not the ending. After you get a handle on things, the generator breaks, and your engineers determine that it is a lost cause. So you start scrambling to save as many people as you can, which is extremely stressful. Just like in Project Zomboid, this is how you died. It's not, this is your comeback story. Trying to get a handle on this broken city at the end of its rope is a truly enthralling and stressful experience that will require numerous tries. Somebody should make a speedrun of how fast they can get exiled from Winterhome. I'd watch it. Next up we have The Last Autumn. This is the most distinct scenario from A New Home, and I think it is the most difficult one in terms of the long game. It's distinct because, as you can see, at the start, there's no snow on the ground at all. There's no temperature problems you have to deal with. Things are great. What you will be dealing with in this scenario is the motivation of your workers as they are faced with being forced to work in unsafe conditions. There is a wrench driven between the workers and the engineers, and you have to deal with the fallout of you choosing to side with one of those parties. At this point in the Frostpunk timeline, there are still a lot of people that don't think the Great Frost is coming. So as people start dying on work sites due to lack of safety, unions get made, strikes happen, the work ceases. You being the leader of this project, you are given a timeline that you have to stick to in order to complete the generator on time. The government knows the storm is coming, but the people do not, and it is incredibly interesting trying to keep your people as sane as you possibly can by any means necessary. Some measures being very drastic.
Oh, wow.
And unethical.
Yeah, boy.
But when the apocalypse is approaching, drastic measures may need to be taken. The Last Autumn is not only an incredibly unique and exciting scenario, it is also a great bit of world building. Seeing the world just before the Great Frost arrives is really interesting, and seeing how London tried to prepare several sites for the apocalypse was also very intriguing. Another thing that sets the scenario apart is the lack of infinite resource-generating buildings, those being coal mines and thumpers, wall drills, steelworks, etc. Meaning that apart from the readily available trees, the giant piles of coal near your base, and the scattered wood and steel on the construction site, you get almost everything else from the docks. Deciding what resources to have your docks bringing in is immensely important. You either choose steel, coal, or wood from the docks. You can get food from the docks, but you have to build a specific fishing dock, which will not be able to switch between resources like the other basic docks. You can also only place 4 docks in total, so you must choose wisely, because the only other way to get food is with your scouting parties. Your scouting parties in this DLC are called foragers, and they mainly gather food by setting up outposts, like the outpost teams in the base game, to send food to the city. But there are times when you encounter extra equipment, and you have to choose whether to doom another city's generator construction in favor of completing your own. At one point, you find some supplies designated for Winterhome, and if you do choose to take it, then you are likely the reason the generator in Winterhome needed to be fixed in the first place, and therefore you're responsible for the fall of Winterhome happening.
What have I done?
This world is brutal, and this scenario rocks. It also addresses my biggest complaint about the base game with the choices between order and faith. Those two choices weren't very different, but the choices between siding with the workers and the engineers, those are two very distinct paths, and both of them have the potential to lead to hell. If you want a super in-depth review of this scenario, go watch Bricky's review on it. All I have to say is that this scenario can go to some extremely dark places, and I think that the feeling of dread this scenario filled me with was second to none. It was the most powerful scenario to me. It is peak Frostpunk, especially when the storm finally arrives and your docks freeze, cutting off your resources, leaving you completely stranded, and screwed if you didn't stockpile enough food or coal to survive the storm. Just incredible. and horrifying. Lastly, we have On the Edge. Taking a step back to the feel of a new home, On the Edge puts you in charge of a small outpost that is reliant on New London, the city you build in the base game, for supplies. When the relationship with New London becomes strained due to them asking for far too much from you, you get the choice to cut off your supplies to New London or not. This scenario is about your little cliffside settlement becoming its own power in the world. You don't have a generator, but you do have braziers that you can place around the settlement to keep it warm. The main thing that sets this story apart from the rest is the forming of relationships with some other settlements that you can find with your scouting parties in the Frostland. Each settlement can provide you with an important resource. Essentially, this scenario can be summed up as overcoming the apocalypse with the power of friendship. And it is awesome. Overall, all the scenarios rank from good to amazing, and they're all worth experiencing at least once. There's not a single bad one. There's an old saying, the path to hell is paved with good intentions. I don't think there's a game that embodies that better than Frostpunk. In this game, your goal is a noble one, arguably the most noble goal a person could have, to save humanity from extinction. The human condition is the biggest obstacle that stands between the success or failure in this goal. This is best illustrated by the laws you can sign. At the end point of the purpose law trees, there are options that completely eliminate the need to manage people's hope ever again. Because you make anybody who questions you a criminal or a heretic, and deal with them the way any fanatical dictator would. This is effectively putting the game in easy mode, and when you finish the game, the end game summary does not reward you for your success in your task, because survival at the cost of everything that makes life worth living is not living. Humanity is the most important thing to preserve. Despite its flaws and downright terrifying capabilities, the goodness and freedom of humanity is something worth living and fighting for, and living in a world without them is worse than death. It's an oddly beautiful love letter to humanity, despite its bleak story and recognition of the potential evil in humanity. I really do love this game, and it's getting a sequel. Frostpunk 2 is coming out soon, and I couldn't be more excited. Based on the trailers I've seen, it looks like it takes place a significant amount of time after the first game. I could be wrong. I know there was a beta, but I missed it, and I don't want to spoil anything for myself by watching somebody else play through it. I don't know what the game's story will entail, but I imagine that old saying will be a large part of it. I hope that the sequel brings a whole new kind of horror to the game's world. I first played Frostpunk back when it initially came out, and coming back to the game after all of the DLC had been added was an amazing experience. Do I recommend this game? Absolutely. But you gotta be in the mood for it. Like many of the games I've talked about up until this point, however, it is a challenging game, and it will certainly stress you out. Fuck, I gotta play some easier games. Why do I do this to myself? So you gotta be in the mood for it. Other than that, I won't speculate or drum up any false hype or hope, because the real excitement is enough. I look forward to seeing what 11-Bit Studios does with the sequel. Hello! Thank you so much for watching the video. It means the world. Have you played Frostpunk? What is your favorite scenario? What scenario gave you the hardest time? For me, I think it was Winterhome, but I do think that The Last Autumn is more difficult. Are you excited for the sequel? Also, what'd you think of the story I told at the start of this video? Let me know down below. I read all your comments. This video is a lot longer than I thought it would be. I just started typing and I couldn't stop. I just had to yap. Hey, look at this.
Holy Jesus. What is that? What?
I want to thank everybody who has watched my content up until this point, and especially those who have subscribed. I know I'm not a huge channel or anything like that, but the overwhelming majority of comments I've received on my videos up until this point have been very supportive and constructive, and for that, I just want to say thank you. Truly. There's always the odd, unhinged comment here and there, but for the most part, you've all been wonderful. I'm almost at 1,000 subscribers, which is a big deal for me, and I know I couldn't have done that without your support. Alrighty, with all that said and done, I'll shut up and I'll get out of here. Thank you again so much for watching. If you enjoyed, please feel free to subscribe. It truly means the most. Stay safe out there. Be kind to yourselves. And I'll see you in the next video. Have a good one.